Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thank you to the Royal Society for giving me this opportunity. It's really exciting. I was just sitting at the back of the room thinking, oh, I wish I'd rearranged my slides differently for this audience, but we'll have to go with what's here. But basically, the title of my talk is like the punchline of this talk. It's kind of where I've got to, but actually what I'd like to take you through is a bit of the thinking behind how I got there. And then I will try and describe a little bit of some of the actual research we do in the lab. So I actually started out work here, just up the hill here at Victoria University as a PhD student, and I was studying the hormone prolactin. And I've kind of put this slide together about prolactin because if anyone in the room has done any biology at all, you're probably familiar with what prolactin does. It's the pituitary hormone that's required for lactation. So people think of it as the lactation hormone, the milk-producing hormone, prolactin. It's a beautifully named hormone, and so this, I sort of think, what's in a name? This is a picture from Time magazine in 1939, a picture of the American scientist Oscar Riddell, who named the hormone in the 1920s. So he got that recognition for coming up with the name of the hormone. And I guess I've spent probably 20 years of research now trying to undo the idea that prolactin is a lactation hormone. It absolutely is. That's my trouble, is it absolutely does lactation. But every single vertebrate has prolactin. How many of them lactate? So about 90% of the animals in the world that have prolactin don't lactate, including all the males in the room. So probably it does something else as well as lactation. We started thinking about, I guess, our contribution to this sort of idea that prolactin must be doing something else is when we were looking at prolactin receptor expression in the brain. And this is a figure that came from Rosie Brown when she was a PhD student in my lab. I have to use the spotlighty thing. So I actually started out, we were trying to study the small group of neurons in the base of the hypothalamus right down here, and you can see that they're labeled green. But if you look at the rest of the brain, these are brain sections through a mouse brain. This particular animal is a transgenic mouse that labels the prolactin receptor with a green stain. And you can see the prolactin receptor is right throughout the brain. So if it's a lactation hormone, why does the brain full of receptors for it? So that was the sort of question that we had. Why would there be so many prolactin responsive neurons? The implication would be that when prolactin levels are high, as they are in pregnancy, as they are in lactation, it has the potential to regulate a whole lot of things, particularly in the brain, is what we were interested in. And why would that be? So I started thinking about this, and as I say, this is what I've been working on for a number of years now. We focused on pregnancy as a time when prolactin is really, really high. And then you think about what happens in pregnancy. Well, actually a whole lot of stuff happens in pregnancy, as you're probably all aware. But if I was to ask you to make a list, you might come up with the left-hand side of this list. You might come up with, there's a change in the mammary gland, there's growth of the uterus, there's a placenta forming. You might come up with the fact that the cardiovascular system changes, the respiratory system changes. You might come up with the fact that there's changes in mood, cognition. There's a whole lot of things, and I'm a neuroscientist at heart, and so I'm really interested in this part of the body, the brain, and then this list of things that are happening down the far side there, behavioural changes, hormonal changes, metabolic changes, etc., a whole range of things. I think we'll all agree that prolactin is involved in lactation, so I've given that box a tick. But what about these other things? What is it that the signals to the brain the state of pregnancy? Could that be what prolactin is doing? And that's essentially what we've been working on, the idea that actually the same signal that the body is using to drive something as profound as lactation is also working on other parts of the brain to sort of coordinate the body's response at the same time. So we are probably most known for our work in maternal behaviour, or parental behaviour in fact, because it's the same in males and females, that prolactin has a role in influencing the behaviour, the interactions between a mother and her offspring, or a father and their offspring. But actually for today's talk, I thought I would give you one little research anecdote about this characteristic of lactation. One of the things that happens in lactation is the reproductive cycle stops. So women's period stops, and they go for a period of time without menstruation. And that same thing happens in all mammalian species, and we have studied it in mice. So my question was, is prolactin influencing all of these things? So again, it's in another PhD student, Elaine Hackwell, who's actually now, I'm hoping to see her tomorrow because she's now got a job in Wellington. Started characterizing the hormones that are involved in the control of fertility. So this is luteinizing hormone. It's another pituitary hormone that's required for ovulation. And under normal conditions on the left, it's secreted in a series of pulses. During lactation on the right, it completely flattens out and there is no secretion. And this is associated with a period of infertility. So our question is, what's driving that change? And is there a role for prolactin? We know from work actually that another fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand, Alan Herbison, has essentially characterized that there's a population of neurons in the brain called kisspeptin neurons that are involved in driving this pattern, this pulsatile pattern of secretion. So for this to stop, we think these neurons must be turned off. And the reason I wanted to talk about this is we've actually adopted some methods that Alan pioneered. And when I was reflecting on my scientific career, the stuff we're doing now is like science fiction to when I started 30 years ago, 25 years ago, studying neuroendocrinology. Because we're actually now able to identify a population of cells in the brain, kisspeptin cells in the brain, and study what they are doing in a live animal as it's going about its daily business. And I don't have time to go into the methods, but essentially it involves a combination of using a genetically encodable calcium indicator, which gives us a readout of neuronal activity of a cell or a group of cells. And then we can implant a fiber optic cannula into the brain so we can visualize that fluorescence. And then we just plug the mice in to a recorder and watch them over time, and they just go about their business. And this is the sort of thing we see. These neurons are quite amazing because as a population, you sort of see nothing, whoomph, they all go together at once. And they do that about once an hour. In a female, slightly less frequent in a male. And if we take blood samples at the same time, we see that every one of those bursts of activity is followed by release of the hormone that's involved in fertility. So what Elaine did, now there's a massive amount of data on this slide, and she basically just followed the mice from when they were, before they were pregnant, through reproductive cycles, after mating, right through pregnancy, through lactation, and after the pup. So these are the same animal, recorded multiple different times. And for the purpose of today's talk, I really just want to focus on lactation. So this is day 7 of lactation. You can see nothing is happening. So these neurons are completely turned off. And what Elaine's question was, is prolactin doing that? So they're going from being highly active to turned off to coming back active again once the lactation is over. And the way that we tested that is essentially we knocked out the prolactin receptor specifically from those cells. And when we've done that, these bursts of activity come back in. So these are now lactating animals, but then the brain is not seeing prolactin because we've knocked out the receptor. And those cells are being active again. And basically what happens is that they go straight into another reproductive cycle and ovulate. So this graph is just showing the grey line is the normal lactation. They basically have no cycle until we remove the pups on day 20, and then the cycles all start. If they don't have prolactin receptors in these neurons, the small population of neurons, about a week into the lactation, they all start to cycle again. So what we think that means is that prolactin is involved in lactation and at the same time turning off the reproductive system. And in fact, we think it's involved in changing maternal behaviour, it's involved in a range of other things. And it's essentially this idea of balance, homeostasis, that the hormonal changes that are driving this particular physiological event of milk production at the same time are changing a whole lot of other things that must change in the body to support that, so maintaining this balance. So I'll finish just by thanking the fact that, as with all of us, I think, have to acknowledge that we work with a team, and I've showed you Eleni here for her PhD project. There's a bit of a long story behind what the people are doing behind me in this picture, but the main reason that I want to show it is just to acknowledge the team that have helped me and the funding bodies, including the Royal Society, that have supported this work. Thank you.
Okay, we do have time for questions.
So implications for practice. So I guess you're obviously thinking about, how is this going to make a difference to people's lives?
I think we think about that a lot. I mean, pregnancy is kind of an interesting situation in human health, because we just hope it works, right? And most of the time it works fine. Everything is fine. But there's a significant number of times when it doesn't go 100% according to plan, and there are problems, gestational diabetes or preeclampsia, or there's a range of things that can go wrong. And so we're trying to understand if these adaptive changes that the hormones are driving all of these appropriate adaptations, if some of those adaptations don't occur at the right time, is that what causes some of the complications of pregnancy? And a good example of this, so when I talk about prolactin and prolactin receptor, I should have actually mentioned that in pregnancy, most of the prolactin is actually placental lactogen. It's coming from the placenta. And we know that certain conditions, and a good example is maternal obesity, which is actually increasing in prevalence in our societies. Maternal obesity can lead to problems with or reductions in the levels of hormones that are being produced by the placenta. And so maternal obesity is also associated with increased risk of a number of complications. And so we're trying to work out if those two things are cause and effect. So it's exactly that, is that when, if the hormonal events are not occurring at the right time or the right magnitude, is that what leads to changes in the output, the outcomes of pregnancy?
Other questions?
Just wondered if you could comment on what prolactin might be doing for the non-mammalian species. Any ideas?
Yeah, non-mammalian. Yeah, I mean, I would have said the best example up until now is parental behaviour. So the irony of Oscar Riddell calling prolactin is he actually purified prolactin from a pigeon. But what it does in pigeons is actually quite similar. It produces a sort of a crop milk that they produce in their throat, and they feed the babies in the same sort of way. But what has been shown is there's a significant role for prolactin in parental behaviour in mammals, so maternal behaviour, interactions with babies, and the same thing happens in birds, for example, nesting behaviour, the encouragement of the animal to sit on the nest or do the sort of interactions with the offspring seems to be driven by prolactin. There's even examples in amphibia and fish where prolactin is having that same sort of effect on parental interactions with the pups. And so that actually makes kind of sense, because you think of if it's a parental hormone, it's been doing it ever since fish and birds, etc. In mammals, lactation's like the new kid on the block. It's just like a new thing to add to the repertoire of parenting. So it makes sense that it's the same hormone that's used. But there are some other interesting mixes and matches of functions that would take too long to discuss, I think.
Last question up here.
Has anybody then looked at the cuckoo?
The cuckoo.
Who lays their eggs in someone else's nests and just disappears?
Oh. Not that I'm aware of, but I've without giving anything too much away, I've just been reviewing a paper looking at some sort of similar behaviour in fish, where a particular type of fish that like to look after their babies, but then other males come in and will inseminate the eggs, and so some of the offspring are actually not from the parent who thinks that it's their nest, and that seems to involve changes in prolactin in both sets of animals that are involved. So I'm not sure of the cuckoo. People probably have looked at it. It's a great question. I don't know.